Veteran bought a 50-cent stone mansion. What his dog found inside shocked the entire town. The road to Silver Ridge wound through miles of frozen pines and silence. Ethan Cole drove with both hands tight on the wheel, his old truck groaning under the cold. The radio had died miles back, leaving only the hum of the heater and the low breathing of the shepherd beside him. Ranger sat upright, one ear flicking toward every sound beyond the glass. The scar that cut through his left eye caught the morning light, a pale reminder of another battlefield. When the truck crested the hill, the house came into view. 3 stories of grey stone, roof line sagging beneath the weight of snow. A relic from another century. The county's paperwork had called it a historical property. The locals called it cursed. Ethan called it cheap. 50 cents. That was what it had cost him to own 4 acres and a piece of forgotten history. He parked near the gate. The air was sharp enough to bite. Steam rose from his breath, and Ranger's in the same rhythm. The dog jumped out first, paws crunching against the crusted snow, nose to the wind. Ethan followed, boots heavy, eyes scanning the property with the same caution he'd carried in combat zones. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful, watchful. The key stuck in the lock before turning with a dry click. Inside, the air smelled of dust, iron, and something faintly sweet, like rot covered by time. The living room stretched wide, empty but for a broken chair and a fireplace still blackened with old soot. Light crept through cracked shutters, cutting the room into stripes of shadow. Ranger padded in ahead, head low, tail still. The floor creaked once under his weight. "You've seen worse," Ethan muttered. Ranger sniffed the corners, then stopped near the mantel. A metal tag hung there, tarnished, stamped with faded letters. CPC Supply Division. Ethan brushed it with his glove, the letters catching in the light. The name below was unreadable. The sound of the wind pressed against the windows like a body leaning close. Ethan unpacked slowly, setting his duffel by the cold hearth, his rifle near the door. The walls carried the echo of emptiness too long unbroken. He lit the first fire in decades, the flames stuttering before catching. Ranger lay near it, his good eye fixed on the flicker as if it meant more than heat. Outside, the snow began to fall harder. By night, it became a storm. The power cut just after midnight. The house sank into blackness except for the weak orange pulse from the fireplace. Ethan woke to Ranger's growl, low, deep, warning. The sound of a soldier's instinct, not fear. Ethan sat up instantly, his hand reaching for the rifle. The wind howled beyond the walls, shaking the glass, but it wasn't the storm that made the dog rise to his feet. Ranger's ears tilted toward the window, body rigid. Then came the sound. A crack, faint, like a branch snapping under weight. Ethan moved to the window and peeled back the curtain. Beyond the yard, between the pines, a spark flared, the brief glow of a match, then darkness again. He felt his pulse climb. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. No car lights, no trail of footprints in the snow. Just that flash, small but deliberate. He scanned again through the storm. Nothing moved now except the trees swaying in the wind. Ranger gave a short, guttural bark. It wasn't random. It was a signal, the kind trained dogs use when they sense human scent. Ethan whispered, "Show me." He cracked open the back door, cold slamming into him. Ranger darted ahead, nose low, tracing the air. The snow came in sideways, slicing visibility to a blur. They followed the prints half buried near the tree line. Heavy, booted, fresh. Whoever had been there wasn't running. They had walked right up to the edge of the property, stopped, and turned back. On the nearest tree, burned into the bark, was a circle with a cross through it. Old military shorthand for cleared ground. Ethan's stomach turned. He hadn't seen that symbol since deployment. He crouched beside Ranger, gloved hand resting on the dog's shoulder. The shepherd was shaking, not from cold, but from focus, every muscle wired tight. "You smell it too, don't you?" Ranger let out a soft whine, then looked toward the woods again. The storm masked everything: sound, scent, direction. Ethan pulled back toward the house. He had no intention of freezing to death chasing shadows. Once inside, he bolted the door, double-checked every window latch, then stoked the fire higher. The room warmed, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. Ranger refused to lie down. He sat facing the door, ears pricked, his one good eye following something unseen. Hours passed. The wind screamed like it wanted in. Ethan stayed awake in the chair, rifle across his knees, mind flickering between memories he couldn't shake and threats he couldn't name. The house popped and settled as if sighing under its own weight. Sometime before dawn, the storm began to break. He rose, stiff, poured the last of the lukewarm coffee from his thermos. Ranger followed him to the window. Outside, the snow lay smooth again, untouched except for the faint outline of a man's boot print, half buried by the night's fall. It led toward the woods and ended at the same tree where the mark had been burned. Ethan's breath clouded the glass. "So someone wants me to see that," he murmured. He turned to Ranger. "We're not leaving." The dog blinked once, slow and deliberate, then walked to the hearth and lay down again, head on his paws, watching the door. As daylight crept in through the cracks, the house looked ordinary. Smoke curled from the chimney, the kind of picture postcard calm that hides what it costs to get there. But when Ethan stepped outside to fetch more firewood, his boot sank into something under the snow. Metal. He dug it out with his glove. A coin. $50, blackened by cold, stamped 1950. He turned it over. Scratched faintly into the edge were the letters W.M., his father's initials. The wind carried a single sound from the woods. A whisper, maybe a voice, maybe the forest itself. Ranger rose instantly, growling again. Ethan pocketed the coin and stared toward the ridge. The match last night hadn't been a warning. It had been a message. Someone was still out there, and they knew his name. The storm passed in the night, leaving the ridge wrapped in silence. By dawn, the house stood still under a white sky, its roof heavy with snow. Ethan woke stiff in the armchair, the fire down to ashes. Ranger was already up, pacing near the door, his breath clouding the cold air that leaked through the seams. Ethan stepped outside with his coffee, boots sinking deep into the snow. The world was pale, soundless. Then he saw them. Prints. Heavy, deliberate footprints circling the house. Too large to be his own, too fresh to be old. They stopped at each window and ended near the propane line behind the kitchen. He knelt, brushed the snow aside, and caught a sharp scent that burned his nose. Gasoline. Not the clean propane he'd smelled before, but something spilled and soaked into the wood. He followed the trace with his flashlight, jaw tightening. Whoever had been here hadn't come to steal. They'd come to watch, and to burn. Ranger limped over, one paw lifted slightly. Ethan crouched, touching the dog's leg. The pad was red, scraped raw. "You caught it before it caught us," he murmured. Ranger leaned his head into Ethan's shoulder, steady but trembling. "You good, soldier?" The dog blinked once, slow and calm. Even hurt, he stood alert, eyes never leaving the tree line. Inside, the smell of gas still clung to the walls. Ethan checked the pilot light, the vents, every inch of the basement. Nothing leaking now. He aired the house, cracked the windows, the cold wind biting through the halls. For a while he tried to shake it off, told himself it was kids, hunters, anyone but what his gut whispered. Then Ranger barked once, sharp, echoing up the stairwell. Ethan froze. The dog stood at the bottom of the second-floor steps, tail straight, ears forward. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly. But Ranger was already moving, slow and silent, nose to the ground. The upstairs hallway smelled of dust and old paper. Wallpaper peeled like dried skin. The light through the window was thin, almost colorless. Ranger stopped beneath the cord that hung from the ceiling, an attic hatch half hidden by shadow. He looked up, growled softly. Ethan followed his gaze, his stomach tightening. "You smell something?" Ranger gave a short bark, one of those specific warning notes Ethan hadn't heard since Afghanistan. He reached up and pulled the cord. The hatch creaked open with a long, reluctant sound. Dust fell like snow through the beam of his flashlight. A narrow wooden ladder unfolded, each step groaning as it settled. "Stay," Ethan whispered. Ranger didn't move. He climbed anyway, slow, one rung at a time, the wood cold beneath his hands. The air changed as his head broke the attic floor, stale, metallic, laced with something else. Not decay. Oil, smoke, and underneath it the faint tang of iron. He swept the light across the space. The beam cut through webs and dust, catching glints of glass, nails, old trunks collapsed in corners. Then it stopped on a shape near the center of the floor, a mound of blankets, dark against the wood. Ethan moved closer, the boards creaking under his boots. He knelt, reached out and pulled the top layer aside. A jacket, heavy wool, military cut. The kind issued decades ago. The patches were half torn, one still intact. CPC Supply Division. The name stitched on the inside collar read Raymond Holt. Ethan stared. He knew that name. Holt was the current mayor of Ridgefield, the same man who had signed the auction papers for this house. The jacket didn't look old. It smelled faintly of tobacco, still fresh. Someone had been here recently. Ranger growled behind him, deep and guttural. Ethan swung the flashlight toward the far wall. Cigarette butts littered the floor near the small window. Some burned only halfway. Beside them sat a metal thermos, still beaded with condensation. He touched it. Warm. Every nerve in his body went tight. Someone had been sitting up here last night, watching him sleep. He turned slowly, scanning for movement, for breath, for anything human. Nothing. Just the low groan of the rafters and Ranger's breathing behind him. Then he saw it, a corner of white under the pile of blankets. An envelope, folded once, his name written across it in thick black ink. Ethan Cole. He hesitated before picking it up. The paper was crisp, untouched by dust. He tore it open. Inside, a single line in bold handwriting. "Leave the past buried, or it will bury you." No signature. Ethan felt the pulse in his throat. The message was clear, but the voice behind it stayed hidden. He crouched lower, checking the floor. The dust wasn't settled evenly. Scuff marks cut across the boards, fresh ones leading towards the window. He followed them, crawled to the edge, and peered out. From this height, he could see everything. His truck parked crooked by the gate, his own footprints from last night, and another set, deeper, heavier, crossing them. Whoever had left that note hadn't come from the road. They'd come from the woods. Ranger barked once, short, commanding. Ethan turned. The dog stood near a trunk against the far wall, nose pressed to the wood. Ethan knelt beside it, pried it open. Inside were folded maps, rolled blueprints, and a small box of cartridges long expired. He lifted one map, edges yellowed, corners circled in red ink. Ridgefield. The hills. The ridge. At the bottom, scrawled in the same handwriting as the note, Development Sites, CPC Program. The red circles marked land. Parcels. His, the old Baker farm, the Winslow property, all former veteran holdings. Taken, sold, repurposed, one after another. It wasn't random. It was planned. Ethan's jaw tightened. He folded the map, stuffed it into his jacket. Ranger stood close, his body still trembling, not from fear, but readiness. The two of them descended the ladder in silence. The morning light through the frost-streaked windows seemed thinner now, the house smaller, colder. Back in the kitchen, Ethan spread the jacket on the table. The wool was rough, torn at one sleeve, ash clinging to the threads. He ran his fingers over the stitched name again. Raymond Holt. The same man who'd shaken his hand at the county office, who'd smiled and said, "Glad to see a veteran putting this old place to use." Ethan reached for his coffee but stopped halfway. A faint vibration rippled through the glass of the window. He turned. Down the hill, parked half-hidden by the tree line, was a black SUV. It hadn't been there an hour ago. The windshield caught the pale light, flashing once like a mirror. Ranger stiffened, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan didn't move. He watched the vehicle for a full minute. No one got out. No engine sound. Just the silent accusation of its presence. He backed away from the window, kept his voice low. "All right, partner. Looks like we've got company again." Ranger's ears twitched, ready. Ethan grabbed the rifle, checked the chamber. The smell of gasoline still lingered in the walls, faint but real, as if reminding him how close they'd come. He set the note and the jacket aside, eyes hardening. "They wanted me scared," he muttered. "Guess they picked the wrong man." Ranger stepped beside him, head high, stance steady, a soldier ready for orders. Outside, the SUV remained still, but Ethan knew what it meant. The message in the attic wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Ethan spent the rest of the morning at the kitchen table, the military jacket spread open beside his coffee. The name stitched across the collar still burned in his mind. Raymond Holt, mayor of Ridgefield, the man who sold him this house for 50 cents. He pulled the folded map from the inside pocket. The paper was brittle but not ancient, edges yellowed, ink still sharp. A county survey of Silver Ridge and the surrounding valleys. Someone had drawn red circles around specific lots. Every circled plot was labeled the same way in block letters. CPC Project. He traced the lines with his finger. Most were old veteran land grants, properties once given to returning soldiers after the Gulf War. Ethan recognized a few names from his father's stories. Baker, Winslow, Harper. Men who had all died or vanished under strange circumstances. Their lands now listed as municipal acquisition under the mayor's office. Ranger sat nearby, tail still, eyes fixed on Ethan. The dog seemed to sense the tension before it was spoken. "You remember Dad's stories, huh?" Ethan muttered. "He used to say corruption doesn't die. It just changes uniform." Ranger tilted his head. One ear perked, as if listening to something only he could hear. Ethan studied the map again. At the bottom corner, beneath the last property mark, someone had written coordinates. He copied them into his notebook. The numbers pointed to the northern slope of Silver Ridge, near the old quarry, now sealed off by fencing and federal property signs. A distant hum broke the silence. Ranger's ears shot up. Ethan turned toward the window. Down the road, parked half-hidden behind the pine grove, sat the same black SUV he had seen before. It hadn't moved since dawn. He stepped outside, the cold slapping his face awake. Ranger followed close, his injured paw barely touching the snow. The vehicle was too far for detail, but the glint of binocular glass caught sunlight through the windshield. Someone was watching. Ethan raised a hand, pretending to stretch, scanning the area through narrowed eyes. No plate visible. Tinted windows. He whispered, "Stay here." Ranger ignored him, lowering his body like a sniper, creeping forward with uncanny precision. Ethan almost smiled despite the tension. "You're impossible," he muttered. They approached slowly through the brush. But just as he caught a clear view, the SUV's engine roared to life. Tires spun, flinging snow, and it bolted down the road toward town. Ranger barked once, loud and fierce, wanting to chase. Ethan held his collar tight. No, let them run. He watched until the sound faded into the valley. When they returned, the front door hung open. Ethan froze. He was certain he had locked it. Inside, the air was different, stirred. The faint smell of oil and cold metal clung to the hall. A draft came from upstairs. Ranger growled low, circling the entryway before heading towards the staircase. Ethan followed, rifle ready. The attic hatch dangled open. The ladder was still down, but something was wrong. The angle of it slightly shifted. A rung cracked under weight. Ranger bounded ahead despite his limp, climbing with surprising agility. When Ethan reached the top, his flashlight swept over a mess that hadn't been there before. The trunk was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, maps shredded. Whoever had broken in had searched for something. He crouched, heart pounding. A small square of fabric hung from one of the ladder's bolts, a torn strip of red cloth, stamped faintly with a faded logo. CPC Supply Division. Ethan's throat went dry. He'd seen that emblem before, on old documents his father used to keep locked away. His dad had worked as a supply officer during his final deployment, managing logistics for the Community Partnership Contract Initiative. CPC. Back then, it was pitched as a federal reconstruction project to support veterans and rebuild rural infrastructure. But after his father's death, the files vanished. The program disappeared without explanation. He picked up one of the torn maps. It was newer than the rest, printed on government-grade paper. At the top was a line of text. Project CPC Phase 4, Silver Ridge Realignment. The date was only 6 months old. The signatures beneath it included Raymond Holt. Ranger pressed his nose to the floor, sniffing along the path the intruder had taken. He let out a sharp bark, then ran towards the window, paws scraping the boards. Ethan followed his line of sight. Out in the distance, on the slope beyond the tree line, something flashed, a reflection. Maybe binoculars again, maybe a lens. Then it vanished. The dog barked again, louder this time, almost angry. Ethan's instincts flared to match his. "They're still watching," he said quietly. He scanned the attic again, forcing his mind to slow down. The jacket, the maps, the message, all of it pointed to something deeper, not a random intimidation. This was cleanup. Someone was erasing history. He remembered the last conversation with his father, years ago in a VA hospital. His father had looked tired, hands trembling as he whispered, "If anything ever happens to me, don't look into CPC. Promise me, Ethan." He'd laughed it off back then. Now it didn't feel like a warning born of paranoia. It felt like prophecy. Ranger whimpered softly and nudged something with his nose. Ethan turned and saw a small metal tag under the trunk. He picked it up. The engraving was faded but readable. W.M. Cole, Supply Division. His father's name. The breath left his chest. The tag had been missing since his father's funeral. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of realization sinking in. The note hadn't been from strangers. It had been from people who knew exactly who he was and what he might uncover. He looked at Ranger. The dog stared back with steady, human-like calm. "You were right," Ethan whispered. "We're not alone in this." Outside, thunder rolled faintly, though the sky was clear. Ethan stepped to the window, clutching the tag. On the far ridge, the black SUV sat once more, engine off, facing the house. This time, he didn't hide. He stood in the open and stared right back. For several seconds, neither side moved. Then the SUV door opened. A man in a dark coat stepped out, just enough for the light to hit his face. Then raised a hand, 2 fingers to his brow, in a mock salute. Ethan didn't blink. He lifted the tag, holding it up like a mirror, and the man turned away, disappearing into the trees. Ranger barked once, sharp and final. Ethan exhaled. The message was clear now. The past wasn't buried. It was hunting. And this time, he intended to dig first. Ethan drove into town before dawn, headlights carving through the mist that clung to the road. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, eyes half closed but alert, his ears twitching at every shift in the wind. The map, the jacket, the dog tag, all of it lay on the seat between them. He didn't know exactly what he was chasing yet, but every instinct told him that whatever his father had been involved in, it hadn't ended with his death. The gas station lights flickered at the edge of Silver Ridge. Ethan turned left onto Main Street, where most of the shops were still shuttered. Only one building showed life, the diner next to the old sheriff's office. A rusted sign out front read, "Bennett's Repair and Supply," though nobody had seen Earl Bennett fix anything in years. Earl was nearly 80, a barrel-chested man with a limp and eyes that had seen too much. He had been sheriff when Ethan's father was still alive, and rumor said he'd walked away from the badge after one call too many to clean up the town's political messes. Ethan parked and stepped out. The bell above the diner door jingled when he entered. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee filled the air. Earl sat in the corner booth, hunched over a newspaper and a glass of whiskey that wasn't pretending to be coffee. "Well, if it isn't Cole's boy," he said without looking up. His voice was gravel wrapped in smoke. "Heard you bought that pile of rocks up on the ridge. 50 cents, huh? Guess they really wanted it off their hands." Ethan sat across from him. "You know why they sold it that cheap?" Earl folded his paper and looked up. "Because no one else would take it. Because anyone who tried didn't last long. And because your old man's name still spooks this town." Ethan set the folded jacket on the table. "You worked with him. You tell me why." Earl stared at the fabric like it might bite. "Where'd you get that?" "In the attic. And this." Ethan slid the metal tag across the table. "Found it under a trunk. My father's tag. It was supposed to have been buried with him." Earl's hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. The metal gleamed dully under the diner's yellow light. "I told him to destroy these." He muttered. He wouldn't listen. "Destroy what?" Earl sighed, leaned back, and looked around to make sure the place was empty. "CPC, Community Partnership Contract. It started as a post-war program, supposed to help veterans rebuild communities, give them land, jobs, purpose. Your dad was the logistics officer for this region. Good man, too honest for his own good." "What happened?" "What always happens," Earl said quietly. "Power found its way in. Raymond Holt was just a councilman back then. He saw the money flowing into the program and realized he could make more by cutting corners. He falsified property transfers, declared certain veteran lots as abandoned or contaminated, then sold them to development fronts he controlled. Your father found out." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He was going to expose it. "Yeah," Earl said, "and he didn't get the chance. Truck accident, single vehicle, caught fire before the paramedics even arrived. But I saw the report. The timing, the location, it didn't add up." Ranger shifted under the table, restless. Ethan reached down, resting a hand on his back. The dog was rigid, his muscles vibrating like a wire, his nose pressed against the metal tag on the table. Earl watched, uneasy. "That one's got good instincts," he murmured. "Your dad's old partner was the same. Rex. K9 unit, shepherd just like him. Smartest damn dog I ever saw. Died the same week your father did. Officially hit by a vehicle. Funny coincidence, huh?" Ethan's hand stilled. "They killed his dog too." Earl nodded slowly. "Rex was trained to retrieve and protect evidence. If your dad hid something, That animal would have found it. They couldn't risk that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old envelope, yellowed and sealed with tape. He placed it on the table between them. I held on to this after your father died. Didn't know if I'd ever give it to anyone. Inside's a file he sent me. Proof of transfers, payment ledgers, and something else. I never opened the second folder. It's marked Restricted, Holt. Ethan hesitated before taking it. Why now? Because the same people who buried your father are still out there, Earl said, and you just kicked the hornet's nest. That house wasn't a gift. It was bait. The words landed heavy. Ethan looked down at the envelope, at the weight of what it carried. Outside, the rumble of a truck engine passed slowly by the diner, then faded. Earl's eyes flicked to the window and back. You weren't followed here, were you? Ethan didn't answer. Earl grunted. Didn't think so. Listen to me. If you open that file, you can't unsee it. And once you know, they'll know you know. Ranger gave a soft whine, pawing at the floor. The metal tag had fallen from the table, landing near his paws. When Ethan bent to pick it up, the dog pressed his nose to it again and froze. His body went rigid, ears straight, tail stiff. Then he gave a deep, mournful sound Ethan had never heard from him before. Almost a cry. What's wrong with him? Earl asked. Ethan shook his head. I don't know. He's reacting to it, like he knows. Dogs remember scents, even ones they've never met. That tag's got history. Maybe he's smelling the ghost of the one who came before him. Ranger lay down then, still trembling, his eyes fixed on the tag. Ethan ran a hand over his fur, feeling the tension beneath. He's not scared, Ethan whispered. He's angry. Earl watched in silence. The old man's expression softened, regret shadowing his features. Your father once told me dogs are mirrors. They feel what we can't admit. Maybe he's showing you what you already know. Ethan looked at the tag again. The letters glinted faintly under the light. W.M. Cole. And below, a faint engraving he hadn't noticed before. Unit K9 Rex. He exhaled slowly, the air, leaving him like a confession. They didn't just kill him, he said quietly. They erased him. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the diner windows. Earl glanced toward the street, then leaned closer. You'd better get back up that mountain before they realize you're not playing along. If Holt's people are watching you, you've got maybe a day before they make a move. Ethan stood, pocketing the tag and the envelope. Then I'd better move first. Earl nodded, his face grave. Be careful, son. Your father wanted to fix the system. You? You might have to burn it down. Ethan turned toward the door. Ranger followed, his limp almost gone now, as if purpose had mended what pain could not. When they stepped into the cold, the wind hit them hard, carrying with it the smell of snow and oil. The sky above Silver Ridge darkened, a storm building again. Ethan looked down at Ranger. Let's finish what they started. The dog didn't bark. He simply looked ahead, steady, silent, like a soldier ready to march back into war. By the time Ethan returned to the ridge, night had fallen hard. The road was slick with ice, the world around him drowned in silence. Ranger sat upright in the truck bed, watching the tree line as if expecting movement. Every shadow looked alive. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of warning. Earl's words echoed in his mind. Holt still has eyes everywhere. The lights of the old stone mansion came into view, flickering faintly from the generator. It felt smaller now, colder, like it knew what was coming. Ethan parked near the gate, stepped out, and scanned the yard. Snow had fallen again, thin but fresh. No footprints, no tracks. For a brief second he thought maybe, just maybe, the storm had washed the danger away. Then Ranger growled. Ethan followed his gaze. On the front porch, carved crudely into the frost on the window pane, were 7 letters. Enough. The knife marks were fresh, still sharp at the edges, cutting through the glass like a warning carved in bone. Ethan's stomach tightened. He stepped forward, hand on his pistol, every muscle wound tight. "Stay close," he murmured. Ranger moved beside him, low and silent. They entered through the side door. The hinges moaned. Inside, the house smelled different. Smoke and oil again, faint but unmistakable. Someone had been here, and not long ago. The first floor looked untouched. The papers he'd collected with Earl's file were still stacked on the table. But when he reached the stairs, he saw it. A faint flicker of light beneath the attic hatch. The cord swayed slightly, though there was no wind. Ranger's hackles rose. His low growl filled the hall. Ethan took one slow breath and climbed. Each step creaked like a warning. When he reached the top, the flashlight beam cut across the attic. Empty. Then something glinted under the far beam, a small red diode blinking once before fading. He barely had time to react. A deafening crack split the air. A flash, then fire. The explosion hurled him backward down the stairs. The heat hit first, like a wave of metal and flame, followed by the roar of splintering beams. He landed hard, the breath torn from his chest. Ranger barked wildly, circling him, tugging at his sleeve, pulling him towards the door. Smoke swallowed the hall in seconds. Ethan forced himself up, coughing, eyes burning. The house that had stood for a century was collapsing around him. The wooden frame groaned and buckled. Flames crawled up the walls with unnatural speed, feeding on accelerant already laid. Whoever had set this fire knew what they were doing. "Come on!" he shouted. Ranger darted ahead, navigating through the smoke like he could see the path. Ethan followed the sound of his barks, stumbling over debris, half blind. The front door jammed halfway. He threw his shoulder into it. Ranger jumped through first, vanishing into the snowstorm outside. The second blast came from the back of the house, smaller but enough to throw sparks into the air. Ethan dove forward as the porch caved in behind him. He hit the ground hard, rolling into the snow, choking on heat and ash. For a long moment there was only silence, the sound of fire eating wood, the hiss of snow melting on contact. Then Ranger was there again, pressing against him, whining low, pawing at his chest like checking if he was still breathing. "I'm good," Ethan gasped, voice hoarse. "I'm good, boy." The fire glowed against the trees, painting the snow orange. The mansion that had once stood as a monument to forgotten men was now nothing but a pyre. Ethan sat up slowly, wiping soot from his face. The cold cut through the burns on his hands, the pain sharp enough to keep him grounded. That's when he saw it, a small blackened shape, half buried in the snow near what used to be the back porch. A box. Metal, scorched. The latch twisted from heat, but still intact. Ranger found it first, pawing at the corner, whining urgently. Ethan crawled over and pulled it free. It was heavy, no bigger than a lunch tin, but sealed tight. The paint on the lid had blistered away, revealing faint letters underneath. W. M. Cole. His father's name. The firelight reflected off the metal, flickering like breath. Ethan pried it open with his knife. Inside, nestled among ashes and melted plastic, was a small USB drive. Its label, scorched but legible, read, "CPC contracts restricted." He stared at it, heart pounding. This was what they were looking for, what they had burned a man and his legacy to hide. Ranger sniffed the drive, and then backed away, whimpering softly. Ethan looked at him, realizing the dog understood, somehow, that this little piece of metal was dangerous, the kind of thing men killed for. Ethan stood, the box still in his hands, watching as the flames devoured the last of the roof. A burst of sparks shot upward, lighting the treetops. Snow fell heavier now, hissing as it hit. The fire. The world was half burning, half freezing, perfectly balanced between death and survival. He turned towards the truck, his breath visible in the dark. "We're not done," he said. Ranger barked once, low, steady, ready. As they drove down the ridge, Ethan glanced back one last time. The mansion was collapsing inward, swallowed by its own history. He thought of his father, of Earl's warning, of the letter that had said, "Leave the past buried." He gripped the USB drive tighter. Too late for that now. Somewhere behind them, headlights flickered through the trees. The same black SUV rolled slowly up the ridge road, stopping just outside the gate. A figure stepped out, silhouetted by the glow of the burning house. The man stood still for a moment, watching the flames consume what remained. Then he turned toward the road where Ethan had gone, and smiled. The hunt had begun. By dawn, the fire on Silver Ridge had burned itself into silence. Only smoke and the scent of wet ash remained. Ethan stood by the truck, the metal box tucked under his arm, staring at the black skeleton of what used to be his home. The snow fell thick and quiet, swallowing the sound of everything except Ranger's breathing beside him. He drove through the morning without speaking, the USB drive clenched in his gloved hand. The label, CPC contracts, restricted, felt like a curse. Holt's people had burned a house for it. His father had died for it. Whatever was inside could kill him too. But that didn't matter anymore. He needed help. Someone who could bring this into the light. That's how he ended up outside an old newspaper office in Ridgefield. The sign above the door read, "Mountain Herald." Letters faded to ghosts. Inside, the lights were dim, the air filled with the smell of ink and stale coffee. Clara Jameson looked up from her desk when the bell chimed. She was in her 40s, sharp eyes, hair tied back, the kind of journalist who had seen enough truth to know it always came at a cost. "Ethan Cole," she said, standing slowly. "You look just like your father." "You knew him." "I knew what he was trying to do," she said. "And I knew Edna Walsh, the woman who tried to finish what he started. She was killed 2 weeks after handing me evidence about CPC's land fraud. They said it was a robbery." Ethan placed the blackened box on her desk. "It wasn't." Clara opened it carefully. Inside, the USB drive gleamed faintly under the lamp. She turned it over, frowning. "Where did you get this?" "My house burned last night," Ethan said flatly. "Someone wanted this gone. That means it's real." Clara connected the drive to her laptop. The screen filled with files, contracts, land deeds, scanned letters stamped confidential. One folder stood out. Phase 4, Silver Ridge Redevelopment. Inside were scanned signatures, payment transfers, and a document labeled CPC Consolidation Act, authorized by Mayor Raymond. "Holt." She exhaled sharply. "This isn't just local corruption. This connects to the Veterans Affairs Development Fund. Federal money. Billions." Ethan looked at her. "You said Edna worked with someone at the department?" Clara nodded. "Special Agent Luis Mendez, Office of Integrity. He's been building a case for years, but they keep stonewalling him. If we get this drive to him, it's over for Holt. Then we don't waste time." They packed everything, laptop, copies, the drive. The plan was simple. Drive to Denver, meet Mendez in person, hand him the evidence before anyone could intercept it. But nothing in Ethan's life had been simple for a long time. By the time they hit the mountain pass, snow had started again, heavy, relentless, blinding. The windshield wipers struggled against the storm. Clara checked her phone. "Signal's dead." Ethan's eyes flicked to the mirror. 2 headlights appeared behind them. Close. Too close. "Is that car following us?" she asked. "It's not a car," Ethan said quietly. "It's them." The black SUV swerved, closing in fast. A muzzle flash bloomed behind the windshield. The first bullet shattered the truck's rear window. "Down!" Ethan shouted. Clara ducked, covering her head. Ranger barked violently, teeth bared, body braced between the seats. Ethan jerked the wheel, skidding through the snow. The SUV rammed them, metal screaming. They spun off the road, slamming into a snowbank. Ethan barely had time to reload the pistol from the glove box before the attackers were out of the vehicle. 2 men, dark coats, automatic rifles. "Stay here," he said, pushing Clara lower, "and don't lose that drive." He stepped out into the snow, rifle raised. The cold bit through his jacket, but adrenaline burned hotter. Ranger leapt from the cab beside him, growling low, the sound deep and primal. A shot rang out. The bullet hit the truck's frame inches from Ethan's head. He dropped to one knee, returning fire. One of the gunmen fell, the other ducked behind the SUV. The wind howled, carrying sparks of snow and gunpowder. Then another flash. The second shooter aimed directly at Ethan. The trigger clicked, too late to dodge. Ranger moved first. The shepherd lunged through the storm, a blur of muscle and fury. He hit the gunman full force, teeth locking onto the man's arm. The rifle clattered to the ground as the man screamed, trying to shake the dog off. Another shot went off, grazing Ranger's side, a streak of blood against the snow. Ethan's heart dropped, rage replacing fear. He fired once, precise. The gunman fell. Ethan ran to Ranger, kneeling beside him. "Easy, buddy. You're okay." The wound wasn't deep, but the fur around it was soaked red. Ranger's breathing was rough, but his eyes stayed locked on Ethan's. Clara climbed out, camera in hand. "I got it," she gasped. "What?" "The dashcam, it was recording. The whole thing, the license, plates, the faces, the gunfire. Everything." Ethan exhaled, relief flooding him. "Then we have what we need." They moved fast, loading Ranger into the back seat, wrapping his side with Ethan's jacket. Snow kept falling, covering the wreckage and the bodies behind them. The SUV that had attacked them burned quietly, orange against white. As they drove toward Denver, the storm cleared. Dawn crept over the mountains, pale and uncertain. Clara glanced back at Ranger, who was resting but awake, eyes following the horizon. "He saved your life," she said softly. "He's done that more than once," Ethan replied. "And he's not done yet." Clara looked at him, then at the USB drive resting on her lap. "Do you realize what's on this? It could take down an entire administration." Ethan nodded. "And maybe clear my father's name." They fell silent after that. Only the hum of the tires and Ranger's steady breathing filled the truck. Behind them, far down the winding road, a second convoy began its climb towards the ridge. Black SUVs, unmarked. The war wasn't over, but now, for the first time, Ethan had something Holt didn't. Proof. And the world would see it burn before he hid it again. 2 days later, the snow began to melt. The ridge was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was aftermath. The story had broken wide open. By dawn that morning, every major network in Colorado was broadcasting the same footage. A truck under attack in the mountains, bullets cutting through snow, and a German shepherd throwing himself at the gunman. The dashcam video Clara turned over to Agent Mendez went viral before the FBI could even finish its first briefing. Within hours, the Bureau announced a full-scale investigation into the community partnership contract. The findings hit like an avalanche. Holt's signature appeared on over 24 illegal transfers, falsified veteran grants, and off-book payments funneled through shell companies. The mayor of Ridgefield was now the most wanted man in the state, charged with corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to multiple murders. For the first time in decades, the town that had kept its head down began to look up. Veterans from all over the county came forward with stories of land seizures, accidents, and intimidation. Names that had been whispered for years finally filled official reports. The courthouse, once Holt's fortress, now stood as a staging ground for agents, investigators, and journalists. Ethan stayed away from it all. He wasn't looking for headlines, he wanted answers. He and Ranger returned to the ridge the following week. The stone mansion was nothing but char and ruin now, black walls jutting up from the snow like broken teeth. The air still smelled faintly of soot. As he walked through what had been the front hall, the sound of his boots on ash echoed like a heartbeat. Ranger trotted beside him, sniffing every burned beam, every shadow, as if searching for ghosts. Ethan stopped near the fireplace. It was the only part of the house that hadn't completely collapsed. Something silver caught his eye, a small metal box half buried under the debris. He knelt, brushed away the ash, and pried it open. Inside was a letter, edges singed, but the handwriting still legible. It was his father's. He sat back on the floor, the cold seeping through his coat as he unfolded the note. Ranger pressed close, head against his shoulder. Ethan read in silence. "If you're reading this, then I failed to finish what I started. Holt and his people think they own justice. That power bends it to their will. But justice doesn't belong to men like Holt. It belongs to those who keep walking when no one follows. Don't fight them for me, son. Fight because truth deserves a witness." Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the letter. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at Ranger. The dog was staring at him, eyes steady, the kind of gaze that didn't need words. "You kept me walking," Ethan whispered. Ranger rested his head against his knee, closing his eyes as if he understood. The wind picked up, carrying flakes of ash into the sky. From the ridge, Ethan could see the town below, quiet, distant, and finally changing. People had begun to gather outside the courthouse steps, reporters, veterans, ordinary citizens who'd once been afraid to speak, and for the first time, they weren't whispering. Agent Mendes had called him earlier that morning. Holt's network was collapsing. His deputy had turned witness. Warrants had gone federal. "You lit a fuse you can't put out," Mendes had said. "But for what it's worth, it's burning in the right direction." Ethan had simply replied, "Then let it burn." Now, standing among the ruins, he felt something he hadn't in years. Not victory, not relief, but release. The ghosts that had followed him since the war were quieter now, their weight lifted just enough for breath to feel easy again. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back into the box, and stood. The snow crunched under his boots as he turned toward the road. Ranger followed, limping slightly but determined. Halfway down the hill, they stopped to look back. The mansion's remains stood like a monument, not to what was lost, but to what survived. Ethan reached down, scratching behind Ranger's ear. "We did it, partner." The dog looked up at him, tail giving one slow, tired wag. As they walked toward the truck, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. It spilled across the ridge, melting the ice from the road, the smoke from the trees, and maybe, just maybe, the guilt from a soldier's heart. Back in town, church bells began to ring. Not for mourning this time, but for reckoning. Ethan turned the key in the ignition. The truck rumbled to life. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Ranger barked once, a quiet, certain yes. The wind carried the sound down into the valley, past the courthouse, past the river, until it disappeared into the open sky, where justice finally belonged. Spring came slow to Silver Ridge. The snow receded in patches, revealing the scars of what had been lost. The black skeleton of the old stone mansion was gone now, cleared away by volunteers and veterans who came to help rebuild. In its place, a new foundation rose, stronger, simpler, made from the same stones that had once held secrets and fire. Ethan stood in the middle of the construction site one morning, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in dust. The sign out front read, "Coal Haven, a sanctuary for veterans and rescue dogs." It wasn't a memorial. It was a beginning. Ranger limped nearby, his gait steady but slower than before. The scar along his leg caught the sunlight when he walked. It hadn't dimmed him. If anything, it gave him more weight, a quiet kind of pride. Every day, as new dogs arrived from shelters or recovery centers, Ranger would walk up to each of them, sniff gently, and then lie down beside them. The others seemed to understand. He didn't bark much anymore, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. The townspeople came too, people Ethan barely knew, some who had once crossed the street to avoid him. They brought food, blankets, tools, and letters. A young boy dropped off a bag of dog treats and whispered to Ranger, "You're the reason my dad came home." Ethan pretended not to hear, but his throat tightened anyway. The new mayor, a woman named Dana Whitaker, a retired Navy medic, visited the site that afternoon. She handed Ethan a folder stamped with the state seal. Inside was a notice of reinstatement. The CPC Veteran Rehabilitation Fund, officially restored and federally monitored. "We're calling it what it should have been," she said. "A promise kept." Ethan smiled faintly. About time someone made good on that. Across the road, Clara Jameson stood with her camera crew, the wind tugging at her coat. Her latest article had already made national headlines. "Veteran exposes decades-old corruption, Ridgefield reborn." The story spread across the country. Donations poured in from veterans groups, animal welfare organizations, and ordinary people who wanted to be part of something right. Clara had visited nearly every week since the trial ended, documenting the rebuilding process. "I never thought I'd see this town change," she said as she joined Ethan by the fence. "You didn't just take Holt down, you gave people their voice back." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone." He nodded toward Ranger, who was lying in the grass, watching the sunset. "He found what the rest of us forgot to look for." Clara followed his gaze. "What's that?" "Purpose," Ethan said softly. That night, the first lights came on inside Coal Haven. The smell of new wood and coffee filled the air. A group of veterans sat around a fire pit, some talking, some just listening to the crackle. One man tuned a guitar, another threw a tennis ball that Ranger half-heartedly chased before deciding to nap beside the flames. Ethan sat on the porch steps, looking out over the ridge. The stars above were sharp and clear, the kind of sky you only got after storms had done their worst. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something bad to happen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the charred metal tag, his father's. The engraving had faded, but he could still make out the last words etched into it. Unit K9 Rex. He ran his thumb over it, then hung it on a nail above the door. "For both of you," he said quietly. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his voice, tail brushing the ground once before he settled back into sleep. The firelight danced across his fur, golden and calm. By midnight, the ridge was silent again. Only the hum of the wind and the slow, steady breathing of men and dogs filled the air. The kind of peace that didn't erase the past, it just gave it somewhere to rest. When the morning came, the valley below was alive with motion, trucks bringing supplies, children laughing, flags rising on fresh poles. Ridgefield had been a town built on fear, but now it was learning how to build again, this time on truth. Ethan stood at the gate of Coal Haven, watching as Ranger trotted toward him with a worn tennis ball in his mouth. The dog dropped it at his boots and looked up, expectant. Ethan laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Guess work's not over yet, huh?" Ranger barked once, a low, familiar sound, strong enough to echo against the hills. No, the work wasn't over, but for the first time, it finally felt worth doing. Summer came to Silver Ridge like a slow exhale. The snow was gone, replaced by tall grass and wild flowers that bent in the wind. Coalhaven stood complete now, its stone walls catching the golden light of evening. Laughter carried across the yard. Veterans sharing stories, rescue dogs chasing after each other in the open field. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a promise kept. One morning, Ethan walked up the gravel path to the mailbox by the gate. Inside was a thick envelope stamped with the insignia of the Department of Veterans Affairs. He turned it over in his hands for a moment, hesitant to open it. Ranger sat beside him, tail sweeping the dirt, eyes on his face as if reading every thought. "Guess we see what Uncle Sam wants now," Ethan said quietly. He tore the seal. The letter inside was printed on heavy paper, formal but sincere. "Dear Mr. Cole, on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs, we thank you for your service, not only to your country, but to the truth. Your actions have helped restore the honor and rights of over 300 veteran families affected by the CPC program. Because of you, reform has begun. Because of you, we remember what duty truly means." At the bottom was a single line handwritten in blue ink. "You reminded us that integrity is a soldier's last uniform." Ethan folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat with both hands. He didn't smile. Not really. It felt too big for that. But there was a quiet satisfaction that reached deeper than any medal could. When he turned toward the porch, Earl Bennett was there, leaning on his cane, an old envelope in his coat pocket. His limp was worse these days, but his eyes had that familiar spark. "You still get up earlier than the sun," Earl said, voice rough with age. "Old habits," Ethan replied. Earl handed him the envelope. "This was your father's. The army sent it to me after the crash. I couldn't bring myself to open it." Ethan hesitated before peeling it open. Inside was a small velvet case. When he flipped it open, the morning light caught on polished metal, a bronze star, dulled at the edges but unbroken. Beneath it, a thin strip of paper with a single line written in Walt Cole's unmistakable handwriting. "For the courage to tell the truth." Ethan stared at it for a long moment, the world narrowing to the weight of those words. His throat tightened. "He never stopped believing," he said finally. Earl nodded. "Neither did you." Behind them, Ranger padded up the steps, tail wagging lazily. He sniffed the medal, then looked between the two men with quiet understanding. Earl chuckled. "You think he knows what that is?" Ethan scratched behind Ranger's ear. "He knows more than most people I've met." They sat on the porch as the sun climbed higher, warming the ridge. Below them, the town of Ridgefield shimmered, changed, alive. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, not for luxury estates, but for community housing and veteran centers. The CPC fund, once a symbol of greed, had been reclaimed for good. Clara's latest article had gone national. It ran with a photo of Ethan and Ranger standing in front of Coalhaven, the caption reading, "From fire to foundation, the veteran who rebuilt a town." Within days, donations and letters flooded in. Some were from soldiers who'd lost their homes, others from families who'd finally received justice after decades of silence. One came from a widow in Montana. "My husband died believing no one would ever listen. Because of you, they finally did." The story spread far beyond Colorado. Across the country, local journalists began digging into their own town's veteran programs. Small revolts of truth began to rise, not riots, but reckonings. Earl read the headlines aloud, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Seems you started something." "I just finished what my father began," Ethan said. A breeze passed through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and new earth. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of a distant truck on the road. His instincts were sharper than ever, though calmer now. He didn't flinch at noises anymore. He watched, measured, always ready but never afraid. Ethan looked down at him. "You did good, boy." Ranger leaned against his leg, eyes half closed in the morning sun. Later that evening, a news van pulled up to the gate. A young reporter stepped out, nervous but excited. "Mr. Cole, could I get a few words for the broadcast?" Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "You already have the story." She hesitated. "What do you want people to remember?" He looked past her, to the horizon where the rebuilt town met the hills, then down at Ranger, who was watching the reporter with quiet curiosity. "That truth doesn't bark for attention," Ethan said slowly. "It just waits for someone brave enough to listen." The reporter nodded, voice caught in her throat. "Thank you, sir." When she left, the ridge fell quiet again. Dusk rolled in soft and pink. The first porch lights flickered to life along Main Street below. Ethan sat beside Ranger, resting a hand on his shoulder. The metal glinted faintly in the last of the sunlight. "You see that, partner?" he whispered. "Looks like the world's finally learning to listen." Ranger pressed his nose to Ethan's palm and gave one slow, contented sigh. The sound of a soldier and his dog finally at peace. A year later, dawn spilled soft gold over the valley. The air was crisp, touched by pine and wood smoke. Coalhaven sat quiet under the rising sun, its stone walls now strong, its yard alive with the distant bark of new dogs. Inside, coffee percolated slowly in the kitchen, filling the air with warmth that had been missing from this place for far too many years. Ethan Cole stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the light move across the ridge. His hair was grayer now, his gait a little slower, but his eyes still held that quiet steadiness born from war, loss, and rebuilding. Outside the gate, Ranger lay on the front step, tail curled around his side. The old shepherd's muzzle had gone almost white, and the scar along his leg was hidden beneath thick fur. But his eyes, those sharp, amber eyes, were the same, always watching, always guarding. A pickup truck pulled up the gravel drive, tires crunching. A family stepped out, a young couple and a boy about 10, clutching a small rescue pup in his arms. They had driven from 3 towns over to adopt one of the haven's older dogs. The boy's gaze caught on Ranger immediately. "Is that him?" the kid whispered to his mom. "The dog from the story?" Ethan stepped out onto the porch, smiling as the boy ran up. "Morning. You here to meet Scout?" he asked, nodding toward the kennel. The boy nodded, but his attention stayed on Ranger. "That's Ranger, right? The one who saved you in the mountains?" Ethan laughed softly. "That's him." The boy crouched beside the old shepherd. "Does he still work?" Ethan took a sip of coffee, watching the boy's small hand rest gently on Ranger's back. "He's retired," he said, "but he still thinks he's in charge." The boy grinned. "Does he ever stop watching?" Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog's eyes were half closed, but his ears were up, listening to the wind sweeping through the pines. For a long moment, Ethan didn't answer. Then quietly he said, "Only when the truth is safe." The boy didn't understand the weight of those words yet, but someday he would. He gave Ranger a final pat, then ran off toward the kennels where the younger dogs were waiting. His laughter mixed with the morning breeze. Ethan walked to the gate and knelt beside Ranger. "You hear that, old man? Looks like we've got a new generation coming in." Ranger's tail thumped once against the ground, slow and tired. Ethan smiled. "You've earned your rest." Ranger turned his head slightly, eyes still fixed on the ridge beyond the valley, the same mountains where everything had begun. The wind stirred again, carrying the sound of distant bells from town, faint and steady. Behind Ethan, the haven was waking up. A few veterans emerged from the dorms, greeting the morning with coffee cups and quiet conversation. One of them waved to Ethan. Another tossed a tennis ball for a golden retriever still learning to trust human hands again. Life had returned to this place in ways no one could have imagined a year before. Ethan stood, stretching his back, then placed a hand on the gatepost. Hanging there was his father's old dog tag beside a small plaque that read, "For the courage to tell the truth." He traced the letters with his thumb, feeling the cold metal under his skin. "You were right, Dad," he murmured. "Justice doesn't belong to men like Holt. It belongs to those who keep walking when no one follows." Ranger gave a low, contented sound, not quite a bark, more like an acknowledgement. Later that day, Clara arrived with a camera crew. "We're filming a follow-up piece," she told Ethan. "America's still talking about Ridgefield, about you and him." Ethan glanced down at Ranger, who was asleep now, sun on his fur. "Then tell them the truth," he said. "Tell them he's the reason we made it here." The crew filmed quietly as Ranger slept in the sunlight, the breeze lifting his fur. Clara's voice carried over the scene. "They said he didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth." Ethan's gaze went to the horizon. The mountains stood tall and silent, their peaks wrapped in morning light. He took a slow breath, the kind that fills the chest after a long, hard war, and felt peace settle deep inside. As the camera pulled back, Coal Haven glowed under the sunrise, veterans working, dogs running, the ridge alive again. The last shot lingered on Ranger, still by the gate, eyes open just enough to watch the valley below. He hadn't stopped guarding. Not really. When the screen finally faded to black, words appeared across the light. "He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. What's your story with a loyal pet?" And somewhere beyond the ridge, a shepherd's soft bark echoed, a sound that promised loyalty never truly fades. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves a loyal dog. Subscribe to German Shepherd Stories and help us keep their courage alive, one story at a time.